Goatsi Hopa. Greetings, everyone. I'm Cynthia Chavez-Lamar, the Director of the National Museum of the American Indian. I'm delighted to welcome you to the 2022 Summer Teacher Webinar. Our museum holds a deep commitment to the creation of classroom-ready lessons, resources, and teacher training. Our research shows most students learn about Indigenous people as being part of the past. Students also tend to lack an understanding of the diversity of Native nations because the focus may be on commonly known or prominent tribes throughout the United States. As a Native person, I recall learning very little, if anything, about Indigenous people or cultures, or our contributions to or achievements in the arts, sciences, or humanities. Unfortunately, this is still the case today, as most students rarely learn about the richness and diversity of Native nations and their cultures. The museum hopes to help change this, and your participation in this teacher training will help make Native people more visible in our nation's history and conversations. By joining us, you are choosing to be a change maker, and you are playing an essential role in building understanding about Indigenous people. Nitra, thank you for taking time to be with us today. We develop each of the Native Knowledge 360 lessons and resources in consultation with Indigenous people and feature perspectives that are often absent from lessons about Native Americans. Our goal is for Indigenous students to see themselves reflected in their classroom lessons, and for students of all backgrounds to learn more accurate and truthful histories of Indigenous people. When more students and educators understand Native American experiences, it can help build better shared understandings, leading to a more informed public and equitable future. That is our hope. Again, Nitra, thank you for joining the National Museum of the American Indian for the Summer Teacher Webinar. My mother was an elementary school teacher for 25 years, so I recognize and appreciate the time and dedication it takes to contribute to the education of young learners. Being a teacher is one of the most important roles in today's world. Thank you again, and enjoy the Summer Teacher Webinar.
Thank you, Cynthia. We're so grateful for your support and attention to Native Knowledge 360. We're so appreciative that you made time to welcome our attendees today. My name is Johanna Gorelick. Hello, I manage the education unit at the National Museum of the American Indian, and I'd like to welcome you to this year's Summer Teacher Webinar. Today's presentation will focus on the topic of American Indian sovereignty. As with our in-person programs, we generally start with a land acknowledgement. We gratefully acknowledge the Native people on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home in our respective locations today. In the United States, people are increasingly doing land acknowledgements, which can be spoken or written, and are meant to recognize that Indigenous peoples are the original stewards of the lands on which we now live and work. These acknowledgements should be motivated by genuine respect for and support of Native peoples. I live and work in New York City, the homelands of the Lenape and other Indigenous communities. Today, it's home to one of the largest concentrations of Native Americans in the United States. Here you see an image of the Hudson River, which is just outside our museum doors. This amazing river shaped the lives of Native people who lived here prior to European contact. In fact, the name of the Mohican people who lived along the river comes from their name for the river. They call it the Mahikanatuk, which means the river that flows both ways. Please let us know from where you're joining us today. Land acknowledgements are a first step in creating collaborative, accountable, and respectful relationships with Indigenous nations and communities. Many of you may already do land acknowledgements in your classroom. For those who are looking for some guidance, the museum has developed a one-page handout. We also have a recorded teacher webinar on land acknowledgements on our NK360 website. The National Museum of the American Indian is part of the Smithsonian Institution, a complex of museums, libraries, a zoo, and research centers. We have 2 exhibition locations in Washington, D.C. on the National Mall, which you see on the left, and in New York City and Lower Manhattan, where I'm based. The Cultural Resource Center is where we steward material collections, photographs, archives, and contemporary art in our care. It's in Suitland, Maryland, and it's the building on the right. Our museum has adopted these mission and vision statements. By being here as part of this workshop, teachers like you are contributing to the newly adopted vision of NMAI, which is equity and social justice for the Native people of the Western Hemisphere through education, inspiration, and empowerment. We are inspired by the work that you do as educators and your commitment to enriching the lives of your students. One of the most frequent questions that we receive is why we are called the National Museum of the American Indian. The term American Indian, like Native American, is a very general way to speak about the indigenous people of the United States. While neither term is incorrect, it's always preferable to be as specific as possible when speaking about Native nations. This helps students understand that there are vast political, cultural, and geographic and linguistic differences among Native people. We also privilege specific names that are preferred by Native nations themselves. For example, instead of using the term Iroquois, we use the term Haudenosaunee. The Haudenosaunee are a confederacy of 6 Native nations whose traditional homelands are in what is now upstate and western New York. Today, in the United States, there are 574 federally recognized tribes and more than 60 state recognized tribes. There are other Native tribal groups that are not formally recognized. This vast diversity illustrates why terminology like American Indian or Native American is inadequate to describe the differences that exist between these individual groups of peoples. We created a handout called The Impact of Words that further explains the importance of utilizing specific language when speaking about Native people. We're dropping that in the chat now. And for the purposes of today's program, we will be using the terms Native American and American Indian interchangeably because we'll be talking about Native nations generally. I mentioned that I manage the education unit at the National Museum of the American Indian. The museum's education initiative is called Native Knowledge 360. Our museum works with Native communities and educators nationally to help change the way American Indian histories, cultures, and contemporary lives are taught in classrooms. This long-term initiative provides educators like yourselves and students with deeper and more comprehensive knowledge and perspectives about Native peoples. We work to bring the richness of the museum's collection and scholarship along with diverse voices of Native experts directly into classrooms through the creation of online classroom-ready resources and teacher training, like this one. One of the foundational documents for our initiative is the Framework for Essential Understandings. We're putting this in the chat for you now. The Framework for Essential Understandings serves as a foundation for education materials developed by our museum. The Essential Understandings offers alternatives to typical narratives and equips teachers with a conceptual framework for rethinking how they can construct student learning experiences about Native Americans, building on the 10 themes of the National Council for the Social Studies National Curriculum Standards. The Essential Understandings reveal key concepts about the rich and diverse cultures, histories, and contemporary lives of Native peoples. They reflect untold stories about American Indians that deepen and expands one's teachings. The focus of the next 2 days will center around one of the key concepts in Essential Understanding number 5, individuals, groups, and institutions. Most classroom materials do not include Native American perspectives about historical events. Furthermore, curricula typically addresses Native Americans only in the past tense. Contemporary issues are rarely the focus of study. This essential understanding provides a lens on how one might think about American Indians as individuals, members of groups and institutions, and their interactions with other cultures and societies. I want to draw your attention to the key concept that notes today, American Indian governments uphold tribal sovereignty and promote tribal culture and well-being. It's important that students learn about the continued presence and vibrancy of Native nations and the ongoing challenges they face and strides they make. The purpose of today's session is to provide you with foundational knowledge about sovereignty in the United States. Sovereignty is such a big word and often not discussed in schools. At its most basic and simplistic level, it means the ability of a nation to self-govern. For Native nations, this means they have the right to determine their own way of life and to live that life as freely as possible from outside interference. It's important to remember that in the thousands of years preceding the arrival of Europeans in North America, Native peoples lived in organized societies with their own forms of government, engaging in diplomacy, commerce, and cultural exchange. Native nations were not given or granted sovereignty by the United States. This concept is called inherent sovereignty. And as you will learn in today's presentation, inherent sovereignty cannot be extinguished, despite efforts to do so. We will also highlight that sovereignty is both political and cultural. Native people continue to assert their rights to sustain physical, cultural, and spiritual relationships with their lands and in community, as well as to self-govern and maintain social and political relationships with other nations. Our objective is that you will gain a better understanding of the importance of tribal sovereignty in American history and in the United States today. American Indian sovereignty is a very complex topic. For the purposes of today's discussion, we will primarily focus on federally recognized nations within the United States borders. However, as noted earlier, there are many state-recognized tribes and even more tribal groups without state or federal recognition. As you delve more deeply into this topic, you may wish to learn about the Native communities in your local area. Some objects from our museum's collection show ways that sovereignty is represented in visual media. Together, we will examine historic and contemporary artwork to spur conversation and inspire ideas for classroom application. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to remind you to please post any content questions in the Q&A and share your thoughts, resource ideas, and comments about your learning environment in the chat. We ask that you please be respectful of one another. We are a learning community that welcomes different points of views and perspectives. Now, I'd like to turn today's program over to my colleague, Renee Gogi, our Teacher Services Coordinator. Welcome, Renee.
Thanks, Johanna. Now let's hear from one of our historians from the museum, Mark Hirsch. He'll talk about a few of the key concepts around tribal sovereignty, and then I'll join him in a conversation at the end.
Thank you, Renee, and welcome everyone to this session of the Native Knowledge 360 Summer Teacher Institute. Today, we're going to be focusing on the definition, history, and contemporary relevance of tribal sovereignty in the United States. I hope to show why the concept and history of tribal sovereignty matters for teaching and learning about Native Americans. My own understanding of tribal sovereignty comes from working on an exhibition entitled Nation to Nation, Treaties between the United States and Native Nations, which opened at the National Museum of the American Indian in 2014. Today, I'll be drawing on some of the exhibition's themes and content, which I'll illustrate using PowerPoint. I encourage you to tour the gallery if you can, or visit the museum's website to learn more about it. I've included the web address on the first slide, so please look that up if you can. So today, let's define some terms. Let's kick things off by defining some of the words, the main phrases we'll be using today. The first one is tribal nations, and the second one, of course, is tribal sovereignty. Tribal nations. We've all heard of Indian tribes, but fewer of us are familiar with the expression tribal nations. And it sounds like an odd combination of distinct entities, right? I mean, there are Indian tribes on the one hand, and then there are nations on the other. So how can the 574 Indian tribes in the United States today be considered tribal nations? Well, here's why. Tribes are recognized as self-governing nations in the 400 treaties the United States negotiated from 1778 and 1871. Indian treaties, about half of which are still in force, still are the law of the land, have the same status as treaties with foreign nations. And lastly, today, the United States government is committed to maintaining a nation-to-nation relationship with tribal nations. Now, I think this evidence supports the conclusion that Indian tribes are, in fact, tribal nations. Now, you may have noticed that I used the words self-governing in that slide. And I did that because self-government is one of the key components of the next phrase we'll be discussing today, and that's tribal sovereignty. Now, I know tribal sovereignty is something of a daunting phrase, so let's see if we can demystify it. Concept of tribal sovereignty is a legal term that originated centuries ago in Europe. Its definition has changed over time, and today scholars continue to debate its meaning and the many ways sovereignty is asserted by contemporary people. Still, I think we can identify two main components of tribal sovereignty. The first is self-government, the idea that tribal nations have the authority to govern their territories under their own laws. And the second component is cultural autonomy. That's the idea that tribal nations have the authority to maintain the languages, spiritual beliefs, and lifeways that unite tribal members as a distinct people. So for the sake of today's presentation, let's use the following as a working definition of tribal sovereignty. Tribal sovereignty is a tribal nation's right to self-govern, to determine its own way of life, and to live that life on its own lands as freely as possible from outside interference. So try to bear that definition in mind as we go along today. I think it will provide some clarity as we move forward. Now, that said, like many definitions, this one has kind of an unfortunate tendency to turn a dynamic concept into a static, timeless category. And as a historian, I don't like timeless categories. Historians are all about change over time or persistence over time. So today I'd like to place tribal sovereignty in a historical context by looking at the ways the United States and its Indian policies especially affected the rights of Native nations to retain their political and cultural integrity from before the American Revolution to the present. Let's start with the roots of tribal sovereignty. Where does tribal sovereignty come from? Did the United States give Indians the right of self-government and self-determination? Well, former President George W. Bush thought so. Here's what he said about tribal sovereignty in 2004. Tribal sovereignty means just that. It's sovereign. You've been given sovereignty and you're viewed as a sovereign entity. Well, I'm not trying to make fun of President Bush's language skills here. I'm simply trying to say that the idea that sovereignty is something that was given to tribal nations reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of Native American history. Tribal sovereignty existed long before Europeans colonized North America. In fact, tribal sovereignty has existed since tribes themselves came into being. Legal scholars call this inherent sovereignty, that is, the rights of self-government and self-determination that Indian tribes have, and they have exercised since time immemorial, and really have never surrendered. The political organization of Native societies varied enormously before contact with Europeans, and I'd hate to generalize about them. But I think it's fair to say that all Native societies had governments, customs, and laws that regulated internal affairs like determining tribal leadership, membership, and resource allocation, as well as external affairs such as making political alliances and agreements with other tribal nations. And Europeans who came to America knew that about Native tribes. So my point is that American Indian societies exercised the rights of self-government and self-determination long before the US was created. And tribal nations continued to assert that authority long after 1776. Looking at the history of Indian treaties will tell us why. So let's look at those Indian treaties. What are they? Treaties are agreements between nations. When European colonists came to North America, they viewed Indian tribes as nations and began to negotiate treaties with them. The United States adopted that tradition of negotiating treaties with tribal nations in 1778 and continued to do so until 1871. And this next slide is what I call my Treaties 101 slide, which you can see contains some basic information about US Indian treaties. So between 1778 and 1871, the United States ratified approximately 370 treaties with the Indian nations. More treaties were negotiated, but only 370 were ratified by the US Senate. Now, the important thing to remember here is that each of those treaties recognized Indian tribes as sovereign, self-governing nations. It's also true that treaties were the main instrument through which the United States dispossessed Indians of more than 1 billion acres of land, according to recent estimates. So in exchange for cash, provisions, and promises of peace, healthcare, education, and agricultural assistance, tribal nations relinquished to the United States the things Indians valued the most, a good part of their homelands. In this slide, you can see the enormous extent of Native American land loss from 1775 to 1992, but the parts I want you to look at are the maps that show 1778 to 1894. The dark shaded areas represent Indian land. The white shaded areas represent land that was transferred to the United States, mainly through treaties. So as you can see from these maps, treaties were no bargain for tribal nations. And in fact, they got worse over time. As the United States grew in power and population, tribes negotiated those treaties from a position of greater inequality. And as those power relations between the United States and tribal nations became more lopsided, treaty making became increasingly tainted by coercion, forgery, and fraud. And yet, and this is the point I want to emphasize, despite the land loss, beside the forgery and the treaty and the cheating, despite all this, US treaties actually continue to recognize a fundamental aspect of tribal sovereignty, especially the idea that Indians retain the exclusive right to govern themselves on their remaining homelands and to live apart from non-native peoples. So tribal self-government and self-determination survived the treaty-making era from 1778 to 1871, but that would not last. Let's find out why by looking at US Indian policy during what historians call the Indian Assimilation era from 1871 through the 1950s. The desire to assimilate Indians into American society stretches back to the beginnings of our nation's history. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and most of the founding fathers advocated what they considered the spread of civilization to the so-called Indian savages. But in the 1870s and 80s, that aspiration turned into an intentional and systematic government policy to uproot tribal cultures and governing institutions, and to formally assimilate Indians into the mainstream of American life. So I think it's important to ask ourselves, why did Americans decide they could no longer tolerate the existence of culturally and politically autonomous tribal nations? Why were Americans unable to countenance the existence of Indian nations within our nation, the United States, or the nation, the United States? Well, I think one reason is that Americans had come to view tribes as anachronisms, as small, what Americans would have called primitive forms of social and political organization that were utterly incompatible with the modern, powerful, and unified American nation born of the Civil War. Another reason is that Indian adherence to traditional spiritual practices and tribal ceremonies seemed increasingly out of place in a nation that equated civilization with Christianity. So the ensuing assault on tribal sovereignty is a dark chapter in American history, but I think it's really important for students to acknowledge it. And it's important to understand the ways the US attempted to extinguish tribal cultures and institutions. Here are some of the policies and laws that we used to achieve that objective. The first is the forced conversion of Indians to Christianity. In the 1870s, the United States turned the management of tribal reservations over to Christian denominations who sought to convert Indians to Christianity. Secondly, the removal of Indian children from families and communities was a critical part of the assimilation program. Basically, the United States sent Native children to distant boarding schools where their tribal languages and cultures were in many cases literally beaten out of them. And in this slide, you can see a sort of a before and after picture of Chiricahua Apache children at a boarding school, how they looked when they arrived there and how those same children looked after they had been enrolled in the boarding school in Pennsylvania. Another way the United States tried to erase tribal cultures was by essentially prohibiting tribal cultural practices. Tribal dances, songs, customary practices such as feasts and gift-giving ceremonies, all of these things were outlawed, I should say, on Indian reservations. And then finally, the United States tried to uproot tribal landholding. Now, why is that important? Well, basically, by dividing collectively held tribal reservation lands into small parcels or allotments of private property for individual tribal members, the United States sought to transform Indians into acquisitive individuals who would spurn their tribal ties. And in the slide, I have the words that President Theodore Roosevelt used in 1901 to describe this allotment policy that the United States invoked and exercised. And he called it the pulverizing engine to break up the tribal mass. Now, after tribal members received those parcels of land, those allotments, any of the surplus reservation lands were sold to non-Indians. And this was a clear and very egregious violation of treaties that guaranteed that Indians would enjoy the exclusive right to occupy their reservation lands for as long as the grass shall grow and the rivers flow. Now, what did allotment really do? Well, far from bringing Indians to self-sufficiency, US allotment policy devastated Indian tribes and individuals. By 1934, some 90 million acres, about 2/3 of the Indian land base, was lost to non-Indian ownership. So allotment is a critical part and a devastating part of this effort that the United States made to assimilate Native people into the mainstream of American society. The United States also undertook to displace the political power and authority of traditional tribal chiefs, warrior societies, and clans. They wanted to replace the existing power structure, and they did. Now, it is true that Indian leaders and tribal members struggled to retain their authority. Many of them visited Washington to assert their tribal rights of self-government and self-determination. And in this slide, you can actually see 4 Pueblo Indian leaders in front of the US Capitol in 1923. And you'll notice they're holding these canes. They're called governing canes, which were first given to the Pueblo tribal leaders hundreds of years before to recognize their sovereignty and the governing status of the tribal leaders. And Abraham Lincoln also gave these governing canes to tribal leaders, I believe in 1863. But despite the effort of tribal leaders to hold on to tribal power, to exercise their sovereign rights, their people's sovereign rights of self-determination and self-government, their voices were basically largely ignored. And so by the 1950s, the real government in Indian country was the United States Bureau of Indian Affairs. The Bureau of Indian Affairs controlled the affairs of Indian tribes pretty much unilaterally and with an iron hand. So as you can see, the exercise of tribal sovereignty was badly eroded by the 1950s. Even on Indian reservations, one scholar reminds us, quote, the idea that Indian tribes were sovereign governments that could make and enforce laws was of no moment at all, end quote. But again, things were about to change. Let's look at what happened and why during what historians call the era of self-determination from 1970 to the present. The era of tribal self-determination, basically, how did this come about? I would say what happened was that Indians decided essentially to take matters into their own hands. After generations of living under the thumb of federal bureaucrats, after decades of having no say over the day-to-day decisions that govern their lives and their communities, and after being told over and over that their native languages and cultures had no place in the modern world, after all that and more, Indians began to imagine a new world for themselves and future generations. Native activists and organizations resolved to take back their reservations, to rejuvenate their tribal governments, to restore the nation-to-nation relationship that had existed between the United States and tribal nations during the treaty era. And they resolved to exercise the right to be politically, culturally, and socially distinct people in modern America. In short, they asserted the rights of tribal sovereignty. So what promoted this change, this Indian Renaissance, as one historian has called it? Well, one of them, I think, is that Native veterans, that is, veterans who had fought in the armed services during World War I and, sorry, I beg your pardon, during World War II and in Korea, returned home to find that the federal government was running reservations essentially like dictatorships. The second factor is termination. That was a concern about Congress's new termination policy. That was a big factor in the 1950s. Termination was a policy that was enacted by Congress. It was intended to emancipate Indians from federal control and ensure that Native people enjoy the same rights and privileges and be subject to the same laws as other American citizens. And you can see in this slide some of the things that determination policy involved: dismantling tribal governments, selling and distributing reservation assets to tribal members, ending federal services to Native people, and of course, assimilating Indian people into American society. Instead of essentially freeing Native people to be like others, to be like other Americans, tribal communities fell into ruin. Reservation resources were plundered by non-natives, and having lost access to federal Indian programs, members of terminated tribes fell into poverty or migrated to cities to find new lives. Opposition to termination, though, was not the only factor that promoted this new era of self-determination. I think it's important to realize that the African-American civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s showed Native Americans that an oppressed minority group in American society could fight for and win their rights. Now, it's all well and good to say that, but I think it's important to note that African Americans were demanding equal rights under the law. Native Americans were asserting something different, which is to say the right to maintain distinct political and cultural communities. And that is one of the things that makes Native American people fundamentally different from other members of, or I should say, other minority groups in American society. Treaty rights also became a major focus of Native activism in the 1960s and 70s, and probably the epicenter, I would say, of the treaty rights movement was Western Washington State, where tribal fishermen essentially rose up and demanded that their treaty guaranteed rights to fish for salmon. Those rights were guaranteed by treaties in the 1850s. That those treaties and that right to fish was being challenged by state laws, and those tribes and those tribal fishermen won in the U.S. court. They won the right that was guaranteed to them in treaties. And finally, Native assertions of tribal self-determination received a really critical assist from a rather unexpected source in 1970. In that year, President Nixon released a special message to Congress on Indian affairs. And the message essentially repudiated termination and committed the US to supporting tribal self-determination. And that was followed up, that remarkable address that President Nixon gave in 1970 was followed up by Congress, which passed the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act in 1975, which enables tribes to plan, operate, and administer federally funded programs for American Indians. There were also other pieces of legislation that Congress passed, and I've listed some of them here in this slide. The American Indian Religious Freedom Act, the Indian Child Welfare Act, all of these different acts made incredible reforms and helped Native tribes achieve greater self-determination, to be self-governing, and to exercise their cultural autonomy. Now, this remarkable transformation of Indian country that began in 1870, this rise or renaissance, has continued in recent years. Today, tribal governments, not federal officials, make the great majority of decisions on Indian reservations. Tribes have revitalized native languages and traditional cultural practices. Tribes have solidified treaty-guaranteed hunting and fishing rights and reestablished the nation-to-nation diplomatic relationship with the United States that existed during the treaty-making era. Tribes have also made significant advances in health, housing, education, and economic development. And tribes have also, remarkably, expanded their land base, buying back property that was lost through treaties and allotment. Now, it is true that Native nations face real problems today, continue to face real problems today, and much work remains to be done. But I think the fundamental fact, the takeaway here, is that American Indians have created viable, permanent, self-governed homelands on which to maintain their own life, or I should say their way of life, as a distinct people. I call that sovereignty. So, in conclusion, how can teachers use this information to provide students with a more informed understanding of Native people? Well, here are some suggestions. In discussing tribal sovereignty with students, I would use words such as self-government, self-determination, or cultural freedom, or the right to determine their own destiny, or other terms that delineate the principal components of sovereignty. I think engaging students in a discussion about tribal nations strikes me as a potentially fruitful way of teaching students about the unique political and cultural status of Indians in American society. You might start by asking students to define the word tribe and then the word nation. Then you might ask them if they know what treaties are, that is, agreements between nations. And then I think you can go for the ace up your sleeve, the fact that the United States ratified approximately 370 treaties with Indian tribes, all of which recognize tribes as self-governing nations. I also think the assimilation era provides numerous possibilities for classroom discussion. For example, why did Americans insist on eradicating Indian cultures and lifeways? Why couldn't they just let Indians be Indians? For younger students, you might ask, how would you feel if somebody took away your family? Took you away from your family and sent you to a faraway boarding school where you were punished for wearing your hair in a certain way? Well, for me, the story of tribal sovereignty also reflects Native Americans' remarkable commitment to being socially, politically, and culturally distinct people. So you might ask students, why do you think Native people have fought so long and so hard to remain Indian? Exploring students' own allegiances to ethnic or religious groups, or even sports teams, might provide a springboard for discussion about group identity and people's commitments to it. So I hope this information, these suggestions are helpful to you. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions. On this slide, I've included my email address, and that's a great way to reach me. Meanwhile, thank you so much for participating in today's session, and over to you, Renee.
Mark, thank you for providing a really solid and great working definition for us of sovereignty and the role that treaties play in reaffirming the sovereignty that tribes already have, since tribes were nations before the United States came into being. Native Americans are often taught about through a cultural lens in classrooms. However, identities are also political. Tribal members have status as citizens and as descendants of nations. And teaching and learning about government is part of the curriculum in every state across the nation. It often includes federal, state, and local governments, but almost never tribal governments. So I hope that teachers walk away today inspired to teach that Native people have status as citizens and descendants of tribal nations in addition to their United States citizenship. So that brings me to this slide here that we're looking at. One of the simplest ways that teachers can really make an impact is by showing a tribe's flag and having students or young people learn about the history of the tribe and what's important to them through that visual representation. You can start with the American flag, which all kids are familiar with, and you might choose to share that next to a tribal nation's flag, as you see here. One strategy or thinking routine that you might use is to do a See, Think, Wonder from Harvard's Project Zero. And we'll practice one of those later. There may be the names of tribes themselves on the flag, as you see here on the right, the Pamunkey tribe of Virginia. And you can always learn more and prepare in advance by visiting their tribal website. I want to invite us to use some objects and photography from our exhibition and that are accessible to you teachers online to spur conversation and idea sharing. We'll do this by following the organization and structure of NMEI's DC's exhibition Nation to Nation and some of its key messages to make these ideas even more tangible. The big idea of the exhibition is that the United States and Indian treaties are serious agreements that shaped American history and acknowledge the sovereignty of Native nations. But let's start first by taking a step back to a time before paper treaties. The first section of the exhibit represents pre-colonial nationhood. We see examples of early treaty making and of agreements between nations. But before Europeans, we had our own governments and social structures, our cultural traditions, and our land. What I'd like to do is a see, think, wonder routine with the wampum belt that you see here. This is from Harvard's Project Zero. And we'll use the chat to describe what we see when you look at this object. So go ahead and use the chat and tell me very simply what you see when you look. And while you're doing that, this routine encourages different types of thinking. In particular, students are asked to make careful observations and describe what they see. This is a great routine to start with because it asks kids to demonstrate skills they already know how to do and is very widely accessible. So some of you are mentioning in the chat that you're seeing a lot of purple, you see white sort of squares and rectangles. Some of you mentioned that maybe it's even a tree in the center. These are good observations. This is a wampum belt, and wampum is a shell bead. The purple beads are made from the quahog clamshell, and the other white parts are made from the whelk. These beads predate European contact and were used for adornment as well as for ceremonial and diplomatic purposes. Now let's focus on what you think in the chat. This part of the routine uses reasoning skills and asks for evidence. As you think about what you're seeing, make connections to what you already know through your observations. So again, some of you are saying connection. You notice these things are linked. You think maybe that these are beaded together. That's great. And you see some what might be fringe or leather. Great. So contrary to many people's thinking, wampum was never used as money by Native people. Also, while these are called belts, these belts are never worn. They were created as mnemonic devices to remember important agreements. Finally, what do you wonder about this object? So use the chat. So this portion of the routine helps stimulate more curiosity and sets the stage for inquiry. It also lays a path forward for learning and the idea that this learning is an ongoing process and not an end result. So many of you, these are great observations, and you have a lot of wonderings. You're wondering, why in particular this was made, who owned it, maybe even where it is today. So these are good, very good questions. In this case, the belt records the coming together of the 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois Confederacy. The story is available in our Haudenosaunee Guide for Educators, so we'll have that in the chat for you. And in brief, the 5 nations, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, were not getting along with one another, and they came together with the help of the peacemaker who made the Onondaga, symbolized by the great pine tree that some of you mentioned in the center of the Confederacy. The location of each of the 5 nations on the belt reflects their locations across the state of New York, with a Mohawk on the right. The Tuscarora joined the Haudenosaunee in the 1720s, and that is why they're called the 6 Nations today, which you might be familiar with. Today, the Hiawatha Belt is represented on the Haudenosaunee flag, which is pervasive in upstate and Western New York. So thank you so much for that See, Think, Wonder routine, and something that you might choose to use with your students in the classroom. So that internal agreement leads me to the next belt, the 1807 belt. This Ojibwe belt was commissioned by the British Indian Department official William Clouse to recruit Native allies before the War of 1812, which may be in your curriculum if you're an upper elementary or middle school teacher. So I'd like to ask Mark a question now and bring him into the conversation. Mark, can you share another example of protocol or diplomacy from the exhibition?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Renee. I guess the first thing I want to say is sort of a general comment, which is that the diplomacy of treaty making between Europeans and Native people was really shaped by Native people. The only major thing I think that Europeans brought to treaty making was the written treaty, that is the custom of writing down everything that was agreed to. That was not done by Native people before Europeans in their own diplomacy with other tribes. Everything that happened at treaty negotiations came out of Native traditions. And Europeans basically adopted these different tribal protocols of diplomacy because they realized if they were going to get anything from Native people, land or access to certain resources, they were going to have to negotiate treaties and negotiate those treaties the way that Indian people did it. And one of the main protocols of diplomacy that came out of Native traditions was the use of ceremonial pipes. So before any business was conducted between European colonists and Indian leaders at these early and even during American treaty negotiations, before any business happened, they sat down with one another at the treaty grounds and smoked pipes, tobacco in pipes, ceremonial pipes. And why did they do that? They did that because this was a way of sort of sanctifying the event of treaty making. It essentially meant that the smoke that rises from the pipes goes up in the air and to the creator. And the creator would be very cross if people were not speaking the truth. So it was a way of making a binding agreement, a solemn agreement. And we had in the treaty, we had in the exhibition many examples of those kinds of ceremonial pipes, and they were fundamental to treaty making, both in the colonial period and in the U.S. treaty making period.
Mark, thanks for sharing that, because I think what you're saying, you mentioned the smoke and the tobacco being used and sort of a covenant with the creator, also really binding relationships with each other, which really leads us sort of to the next big section of the exhibition, the second section, which is serious diplomacy and early treaty making. Excuse me. So in the first years, treaties were a good deal for both sides, and relationships were really sought after. They represented peace and friendship. Nearly 400 treaties were signed, as you mentioned, and about 368 of those were ratified between the United States and Native nations. These treaties hold both sides accountable and constituted, and still do, serious diplomacy. One of the early forms of diplomacy and gift exchange were peace medals. So here you see a George Washington Peace Medal. And we know that one of the George Washington Peace Medals went to Red Jacket of the Seneca, which you see on the right-hand side of the screen. This particular one from NMAI's collection that is shown was used by the Wendat, or today known as the Wyandot Nation. It's a very large peace medal, and by the imagery, we can see that it represents the friendship and goodwill of early treaty making. So Mark, can you tell us a little bit about what these early treaty meetings looked like?
Sure, thanks, Renee. Treaty making happened either in Indian country, that is to say in the places where Native nations lived and existed. Sometimes they happened in Washington, D.C., but many of them happened in Indian country, and they were very important events. One of the first things that was done was the treaty tribes would construct kind of arbor or canopy to cover both the U.S. treaty commissioners and the tribal leaders, to keep them out of the sun, of course, but it was also to give this event an air of the importance that it actually reflected. And inside that canopy sat the treaty negotiators from the United States and the tribal leaders. Typically, an American flag was hoisted near the canopy. And whether that reflected, sort of U.S. hegemony or reflected something very different, which is that it assured the tribal nations that the United States itself was a sovereign entity, as were the tribes. It's unclear, but that's just food for thought. Underneath the canopy, the commissioners, the treaty commissioners representing the federal government and the tribal leaders basically faced each other. And inside the canopy were a host of other people. There were witnesses who signed the treaties and said, yes, we were here, we heard everything that was stated here. There were interpreters who had to basically explain to the U.S. treaty commissioners what Native people were saying and vice versa. Often those people were of mixed race. They often had a Native American mother and a European father who might have been a fur trader. And of course, there was a secretary who sat at a desk, essentially taking notes of the proceedings, but also to collect the signatures of the tribal leaders after the treaty was negotiated. And I am, of course, leaving the best for last, which is the huge number of Native people, men, women, and children who showed up to witness and to participate, not to participate in the negotiations, but to be at the treaty grounds when the negotiations were happening. Just for one example, there were something like 10,000 Native people and many hundreds of Indian ponies and dogs, according to the Americans who left records about this, at the horse treaty negotiation in 1851 between the United States and many of the 9 of the Plains tribes. And I looked up and figured out one day that 10,000 people is a lot in 1851. It was about the roughly the 30th or 35th largest urban center before Nashville. So that's how many people were there: men, women, and children.
That's amazing, Mark. And you've really, I think, painted a picture for us of what that looked like. And we can only imagine what it might have felt like. I remember that really, that 1851 Horse Creek Treaty always stands out to me in the exhibition. And I think one of the reasons it was at Horse Creek is they had to feed the horses. So they had to move the location to feed all of those horses that you mentioned. So thanks for painting a picture of the role, the different roles that people had. So Mark, that sort of leads us to the next section of the exhibition, the third portion, which is called Bad Acts, Bad Paper. And in this section, Mark, the era really shifted from peace and friendship in the beginning to essentially a land grab. There was a change from the earlier era of mutual respect to more coercive tactics by the United States government. Can you tell us a little bit more about that erosion of political status through fraudulent treaties and coercion? What is one example from the exhibition that stands out to you?
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Renee. There is a transition, I think, from those early treaties where there is a kind of parity between, or equality between, Native nations and the United States. And as the United States gets larger and more populous, and as Native nations get smaller and less populous, there becomes a kind of a disparity in power relations. And that opens up the door to the United States essentially using treaties in ways that they really, not that they hadn't been used before, but they become more punitive. The treaties themselves become instruments, mainly for either acquiring tribal lands or removing tribal nations from their homelands to lands west of the Mississippi. For me, the most affecting part of the gallery that really speaks to this transition in treaties is a section where we focused on, where the exhibit focuses on the forced removal of the Pottawatomie's in Indiana in 1838. It's a pretty difficult story, but if any of you have heard of the Trail of Tears, this was not all that different. It involved, again, the Pottawatomie's of Indiana, who will not agree, at least their chief Menominee will not agree to sign a treaty, removal treaty, to send the tribe out of Indiana further west. And in 1838, essentially state militia troops show up, armed, and they force about 859 people from their village, which was near Twin Lakes in Indiana, to pack up and move. And this trip lasts for about 2 months. I use the word trip, but that's really a misnomer. This was a forced march.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that forced march lasted for about 2 months, covered something like 660 odd miles from Indiana to Pottawatomie, Kansas. And on the way, what happens is that people start dying, especially children. In the end, I think, I'm just looking at my notes here, about 40 people died on that trip, 40 Pottawatomie people. 28 of them were children. And the thing that I remember the most about the exhibition is we include essentially a diary of that march, and every day visitors to the museum could read what happened every day, and it reads like a litany of, it's kind of like an obituary, you know, today 2 children died, today 5 children died. And the more you read this, the more heartbreaking it becomes, and the more I think it underscores for people how the United States attitude about treaties as something that was originally involved mutual consent, had turned into a kind of a weapon for the United States to remove Native people and to take tribal lands.
Yeah, Mark, that's a really heartbreaking portion of the exhibition. And we have a lesson online on NK360 that helps to tell some of those removal stories. So it is a really very tumultuous time. And we see in this Abraham Lincoln Peace Medal from 1862 that was given to a chief of the Menominee, on the back of the medal, which is on the right-hand side. When we think, you know, when we look at this and then think about the earlier peace medal, you know, I think this peace medal becomes very reflective of the time period that we're seeing now in the bad acts, bad paper section of the exhibition. You can see here how it's smaller. The depictions, as I mentioned, changed over time. Now we're seeing on the back of this peace medal, it shows the quote Indians, you know, really on unequal footing. They're being depicted in less than savory ways. They're little clothed, and they look, you know, barbaric. So, you know, we can't help but wonder how this type of imagery changed so drastically and how that sort of reflects the era. So comparing these medals really demonstrate the growing power imbalance that you mentioned, and that we see over time. So essentially the tribes in the US during this era are really not on equal footing. And we see an example of another peace medal by Lincoln. And, you know, here we see really an opportunity for Native people to hold on to that cultural tradition, and also, you know, a Lincoln medal from that same era. So it's very tumultuous time as culture and land. And during the 1830s, many of the removals, a lot of hardship amongst Native people. Also in that portion of the exhibition, Mark, I'm wondering if you can share with us an example of what happened with tribes in California in treaties that were not ratified.
Yeah, thank you, Renee. That is also a very difficult story, but basically what happens in California essentially is an example of what happens to Native people when they don't have treaties. You know, we often say treaties could be really bad, but the example of what happens in California shows what happens when there are no treaties. Essentially, during the gold rush, thousands and thousands of fortune seekers come into California. And they come with a vengeance in search of riches. They come with an idea that the land is theirs and it does not belong to Native people. It begins essentially a kind of a genocide. And I don't use that word loosely. A lot of historians actually use that word. They inaugurate a reign of terror against Native people. And word of this gets to Washington, and the United States decides it has to do something about this. So they send 3 treaty commissioners to California to make treaties with the Indians there. And they ultimately identify tribes. They make 18 treaties because they feel like these Indians need protection, and the way we can protect them is to do what we're trying to do in other parts of the country, which is to make sure we can consolidate Native people on their own tribal lands, on reservations. That treaty is then, they sign 18 treaties with Native nations in California. Those treaties are then sent, as they should be, to Washington for the Senate to ratify them. The Senate decides, we're not ratifying these. And essentially they bow to the pressure of Anglo non-Native people in California who say, you know, this land in California does not belong to the Indians, it belongs to us. And the Senate says, yeah, you're right, okay, we're going to forget about these treaties. And they literally never ratify them. Someone puts them away in a desk and they're not recovered between basically 1852 and something like 1905. They're literally buried in a desk. In the meantime, Native people have no reservations. They have no place of safety. And this reign of terror continues. And essentially what happens between, again, I'm consulting my notes because the numbers are difficult to recall, but they're horrific numbers. Something like 4,500 Native people perished in anti-Indian violence between 1848 and 1880, and the Native California population as a whole declined from about 150,000 in 1848 to something like 15,000 in 1900. That's a 90% drop. So that's a pretty good, that gives you a pretty good idea of what happens and what happened in the case to Native people who did not have treaties that at least recognized some portion of their original homelands for them to live on.
That's an incredible story, and one that that I'm glad we were able to include. And I'll say that, you know, we actually had trouble finding delegation photos in our collection because a lot of people, you know, weren't sent. And as you mentioned, the 3 commissioners came out to California. They sent representatives, but many of these weren't ratified. As my friend from a California tribe said, they talk about how they were hidden in a hidden vault. You know, so you mentioned that desk. So that kind of brings us to today, where there are 109 federally recognized tribes in California and approximately 60 groups petitioning for federal recognition in California. We couldn't find a solid number on the Bureau of Indian Affairs website for national petitions, but it does show over 50 tribes either actively petitioning, declined, or under a proposed congressional act for recognition. So these are, you know, an incredible detriment to the people of California that those treaties weren't ratified to the indigenous tribes from California. And I want to talk a little bit, because as you were talking, Mark, earlier and now in our conversation, a lot of what you're saying, you know, I think for a lot of Native people is almost like a family history. You know, when you talk about allotment and you mentioned boarding schools, it's not so many generations. You know, in my case, my grandmother attended boarding school and then many generations behind her. So, you know, reading these treaties is deeply personal to me. And I'm an Eastern Shawnee tribal citizen, where we had 16 ratified treaties from 1786 to 1867 with the United States. But recently, I was doing some research on my grandfather's people, the Sac-and-Fox, and that made me look at the 1867 treaty to better understand just what promises were made. And since my fourth great-grandfather, Moses Keokuk, was a signatory, you see this picture dated February 23rd, 1867. It's in front of the White House. And it was taken just days after signing the treaty on February 18th that I mentioned in Washington, D.C. So it was really empowering for me to actually read the treaty and to just take a section of it. Article 8 was for the removal of the tribe to a new reservation. Article 9 provided for a new school building and teacher, so education. Article 10 states the U.S. will pay for a physician and medicines for 5 years after removal of the tribe. And ironically, tribes also sometimes partially paid for their own removal. So although so much land was exchanged during this time, it's powerful to know, for me, the treaty, even when the terms are lopsided and unfair looking back now, it's powerful to read those words because I realize the sacrifices that my ancestors made in negotiating them for future generations. So it both humbles me to see Moses Keokuk, my fourth great-grandfather, up on the upper reaches of this building, this powerful building on the left-hand side, and knowing all the choices that he was faced with. And it makes me just really appreciative that they were looking forward to future generations. So many of our tribes talk about the idea of decision-making looking 7 generations forward. One of the comments that I frequently get from visitors when I take them through the exhibition, Mark, is the idea that all treaties were broken. So can you talk a little bit about what might be limiting about this statement? And sort of instead of thinking of treaties as old pieces of paper, can you talk about why they're important for all of us to know about today?
I think they're important because they reflect the solemn promises that the United States made to Native nations. I think their treaties are important because they recognize that tribal nations are sovereign nations that have the rights of self-determination and also the rights of cultural autonomy. I think that treaties are important because they recognize that tribal nations have rights to lands, to a place where their tribal governments can determine the destiny of their people and of the future, can really determine their future. Treaties also remain the law of the land, and they are the supreme law of the land. No state laws can trump the provisions of Indian treaties. Ultimately, because they're not just old paper, because they're still relevant, I think treaties have meaning today. And one of the things I think that they mean is that they're, as I say, sacred oaths. They're sacred oaths that bind the United States to adhering to the bevy of promises that it made to Native nations 150 years ago. And so today, and I think this may be valuable for students to be thinking about, today it's our responsibility as citizens of the United States to acknowledge and to adhere to those promises that were made. They were solemn promises, solemn oaths. And I think we should remember the words of Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black, who in 1960 reminded us that, quote, great nations like great men should keep our word. And to me, that's a kind of a credo for us to live with. And by us, I mean citizens of the United States. We all should know that we should keep our word, that the United States should keep its promises to the United States. And I think it's important that students know that.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And I think it's a concept that students can really relate to, keeping your word, keeping your promises. What does that really mean? So this leads us to the last portion of the Nation to Nation exhibition, Great Nations Keep Their Word. So as a historian, can you share sort of one of the most important stories? And there's a lot of important stories. You mentioned American Indian religious freedom and a lot of important content pieces at the end of the exhibition. But what do you think, what's one example of something you think teachers should walk away with today?
I guess, it's the idea that treaties are still relevant. They still matter. And they still matter, not just because they are still very much the law, and more than half of them are still in effect today, but because people are aware that those treaties existed and that they are not some old paper that has no relevance today. And I think on the slide you're showing there, the Dakota Access Pipeline mile marker, which was in the final section of the Nation exhibit, that was exhibit one, as it were, or the shining example of why treaties still matter today. I don't want to get into a whole discussion about the protest about the pipeline, but I will say that when reservations were identified and when Native people accepted reservations, the United States essentially promised them the ability to live. And that included resources like water. And the Dakota Access Pipeline was both about water rights and treaty rights. And in this case, it involved essentially a community's concern that the construction of an oil pipeline was going to pollute their source of water, a source of water that had been promised to them, and that the construction of that pipeline was going to destroy certain lands, tribal lands, that tribe held as being sacred. And I think the mile marker, which was constructed at the protest site at the Standing Rock Reservation, is an example of how powerful treaty rights remain today, and the notion of treaty rights remain today, that the United States should keep its word. And so for us to exhibit that mile marker at the end of our exhibition about treaties, I think was a powerful reminder that we're not talking about some irrelevant paper. This is a living document, just like the US Constitution.
Mark, thank you so much. I think, it really was also a unifying force. And, it really brought people together. And there's a lot of sort of ripple effect with energy and a lot of indigenous, solar power. People are doing a lot now. And I think this kind of unifying and rallying cry of indigenous people coming together and our allies really launched a lot of new initiatives and efforts to maintain our sovereignty and exercise it. So thank you for your presentation. It showed the remarkable resurgence of American Indian sovereignty in the last 50 years. And your story reminded me that tribal sovereignty today means something different for each nation and in their effort to prioritize what's really important for them. So since so many US policies and the treaties sought to distinguish connections to land and food and lifeways, tribal nations are doing so much right now in advancing their food and cultural sovereignty. And you mentioned water. So water is, the base of all of that, and making their ancestors' promises worthwhile in reclaiming health and wellness and in education and language. For example, regarding health and well-being, tribes are taking control of this through their own midwifery programs in some Six Nations communities in what's now New York State. For other tribes in the Pacific Northwest, which you mentioned, it's about their fishing and gathering rights, guaranteed and affirmed through treaties and court decisions, and a lot of activism and hard work, including fish-ins by their people in the 1970s and work that continues today. Related to the 1867 treaty with the Sac and Fox that I mentioned earlier, the Meskwaki people are involved with food sovereignty to restore relationships that were diminished when our peoples were systematically taken from food sources and practices that lived on the land for thousands of years. Our nations recognize health and well-being as holistic in a lot of our communities and part of our community and ceremony. And language is always central to the values and worldviews and the intrinsic relationships that we had and have with land and food systems, and those that we're rekindling. As you mentioned, people were not permitted to speak their languages through US policy in education and boarding schools, but I can say that in our 3 Shawnee tribes today, we're actively reversing years of language endangerment together through online language revitalization classes that are more accessible to tribal members now that we're virtual. My friend, a recipient of the MacArthur Genius Award, Darrell Baldwin, raised his kids in the Miamia language fluently for the first time in generations. And now those kids are adults who are teaching others, and they even have a language app. So there are a lot of cultural and language and revitalization efforts that I mentioned, but there are some elements that are inward facing. So the Pamunkey pottery tradition, for example, which you see on their flag here at the bottom center of their flag, you see that they have a pottery tradition. It is one of the oldest ongoing pottery traditions on the East Coast. And it's really for their community, though. So they have, tribes also have internal community and cultural revitalization efforts that aren't necessarily outward facing. So in the case of the Pamunkey, the river is sacred to them, the land, and they hold on to that clay that comes from the riverbanks and that tradition for their people. So it's not intended for everyone to touch. So I just wanted to mention that this being a tradition they hold very close, some efforts might be more outward facing and others are more internal and for the nation or tribe. Taking land deprived many of us of our land-based culture, our sacred places, but also our language and knowledge that's tied to the land. And for the tribes still not recognized, they are currently petitioning right now. Their efforts are underway. Tribes are working valiantly to rekindle Indigenous knowledge systems and practices, and that often involves getting land back. I want to thank you for your time, Mark, and for this conversation.
Thank you, Renee and Mark. That was a great introduction to key ideas about sovereignty. In my introduction, I showed the museum's mission and vision statements. Your presentation showed that the concept of sovereignty is complex, but that understanding and teaching it to students is critical to helping us meet our mission to foster a richer, shared human experience through a more informed understanding of Native peoples. Tomorrow, we'll introduce ways that you can integrate some of the museum's resources into your classroom. Thank you, everyone, for all that you shared with us today. And please join me in thanking Cynthia, Renee, and Mark for their presentations. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you soon.